Open the hood of a 1992 Acura Vigor, and something is immediately wrong. The engine is facing the wrong direction. In a front-wheel drive car, the engine sits sideways, compact, efficient. This one points forward, lengthwise. The way an engine sits in a BMW. The way an engine sits in a car built around driving. Honda's engineers didn't do that by accident. The directive was simple: beat the BMW 3 Series, not on paper, on the road. The Vigor was the car. It lasted 3 model years before Acura quietly walked away from everything it represented. So how does a car that got almost everything right end up remembered by almost nobody? To understand the Vigor, you have to understand what Honda was trying to become in the mid-1980s. By 1985, Honda was one of the most respected automakers in America. The Accord and Civic had built real loyalty. The engines were reliable, the build quality was honest, and buyers trusted the brand in a way that most domestic manufacturers could only watch from a distance. But Honda's engineers and executives knew something uncomfortable. Trust wasn't the same as prestige. Reliable wasn't the same as desirable. And no matter how good the Accord got, it wasn't going to pull buyers away from BMW. So, Honda made a decision that no Japanese automaker had made before. They would build a separate luxury brand from the ground up, specifically for the American market. Acura launched in March of 1986 with 2 models. The Legend was the flagship, a smooth and composed sedan with genuine luxury credentials. The Integra was the entry point, a sporty compact that immediately found an audience with younger buyers. The reception was strong, dealers were busy, the press was genuinely impressed. For a brand that didn't exist 18 months earlier, Acura had landed well. But inside Honda, the engineers weren't satisfied. The Legend was good, comfortable, refined, well-built. It competed credibly with the lower end of the European luxury market. What it didn't do was drive like a BMW. And that distinction mattered enormously to the people who had spent their careers studying European sports sedans. BMW's 3 Series and 5 Series weren't just cars to Honda's engineering team. They were a benchmark, a standard of what a driver's sedan should feel like. The balance, the steering response, the way the chassis communicated through corners without drama or disconnection. That feeling came from rear-wheel drive, from weight distributed evenly across all 4 corners, from decades of refinement around a specific mechanical philosophy. Honda was building front-wheel drive cars. That was the reality of the platform, the cost structure, and the engineering direction the company had committed to. Front-wheel drive made sense for economy cars, for family sedans, for most of what Honda built and sold in volume. But front-wheel drive had a reputation in performance circles, and that reputation was a problem. Front-wheel drive cars understeer. When you push them through a corner, the front axle is doing 2 jobs at once. It's steering the car and driving the car, and those 2 demands fight each other. The result is a handling character that feels blunt compared to a rear-wheel drive sedan. Drivers who cared about feel could identify it immediately. Honda's engineers understood this as well as anyone. They also understood that simply accepting it wasn't an option. If the goal was to build something that could genuinely challenge a BMW 5 Series in the segment where driving mattered most. So, they started working on a solution, not a compromise, not a workaround, an actual engineering solution to the fundamental mechanical disadvantage of front-wheel drive. The car that came out of that effort was the Vigor. And the decision at the center of it, the choice that separated the Vigor from every other front-wheel drive sedan on the market, was the engine. Not its power, not its size, its orientation. Most front-wheel drive cars mount their engines sideways, transversely in engineering terms. The engine sits across the engine bay perpendicular to the direction of travel, which keeps everything compact and leaves room for the front wheels to steer without interference. It's an efficient layout. It works well. Nearly every front-wheel drive car built in the 1980s and 1990s used it, including everything else Honda made at the time. Honda's engineers chose to do something different with the Vigor. They mounted the engine lengthwise, longitudinally, pointing toward the front of the car the way a rear-wheel drive engine would sit. This is not a small decision. It changes almost everything about how the front of the car is designed, how the drivetrain connects, how the suspension is packaged, and where the weight ends up sitting. Because the longitudinal layout had never been used in a Honda front-wheel drive platform before, there was no parts bin to borrow from. The front subframe was purpose-built. The suspension geometry was designed from scratch around the new layout. The steering system had to be rethought. The transmission was unique to this application. The reason for it comes down to a single principle: mass location. When you mount a large engine transversely in a front-wheel drive car, a significant portion of that engine's weight sits ahead of the front axle. The nose gets heavy. The rear gets light. You end up with a weight distribution that might read 65% front, 35% rear, or worse. That imbalance is part of what creates the understeer that front-wheel drive cars are known for. Physics doesn't negotiate. A longitudinal engine mount changes that equation. Because the engine sits along the length of the chassis rather than across it, its mass can be positioned further back, sitting closer to or even partially behind the front axle centerline. That pushes weight rearward. It lightens the nose. It shifts the balance of the whole car towards something closer to neutral. Honda's target for the Vigor was 60% front, 40% rear weight distribution. For a front-wheel drive car, that number is remarkable. Most front-wheel drive sedans of that era were running something closer to 63 or 64% front bias. A few points of difference might sound insignificant, but in chassis dynamics, those numbers matter. They change how the car enters a corner, how it responds to steering input, how it behaves when the driver asks something of it at the limit. Then there's the engine itself. Honda chose an inline-five cylinder, a 2.5-liter unit producing 176 horsepower. 5 cylinders was an unusual choice in 1992. Most volume manufacturers were building 4s and 6s. A 4-cylinder was lighter and cheaper. A 6 was smoother and more prestigious. 5 sat in between, and that position gave it a specific mechanical character that's difficult to describe unless you've experienced it. A 4-cylinder engine fires every 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation. A 6 fires every 120 degrees. A 5 fires every 144 degrees. That uneven interval creates a sound and a vibration signature that is entirely its own. Not rough like a 4 under stress, not the polished hum of a 6, but something with a slight complexity to it. A layered quality that some drivers found genuinely appealing. Under hard acceleration, the 5-cylinder had a note that didn't sound like anything else in the segment. The smoothness at cruise was real. Honda balanced the engine carefully, and the longitudinal mount, with its more direct connection to the drivetrain, allowed the power delivery to feel linear in a way that transverse setups sometimes don't. It wasn't a powerful engine by any measure, but it wasn't trying to win on horsepower. Almost nothing carried over from existing Honda architecture. The Vigor's front end was essentially a new engineering problem solved entirely from first principles. On paper, the result was extraordinary. A front-wheel drive sedan with the weight balance of something much more expensive, powered by an engine with a character all its own. The paper was convincing. The question was whether the road would agree. The road tests started appearing in early 1992, and the language the journalists used was telling. Car and driver called the Vigor's handling unusually neutral for a front-wheel drive car. Road and Track noted the steering felt direct and communicative. Automobile magazine made the comparison that Honda had been quietly hoping for, describing the Vigor's chassis behavior as closer in character to a European sports sedan than anything else in its class. These weren't soft compliments. These were writers who drove BMWs regularly, who understood exactly what they were comparing it to, and who were genuinely surprised by what the Vigor did under them. The understeer was reduced, not eliminated, because the physics of front-wheel drive don't disappear no matter how clever the engineering, but noticeably, meaningfully reduced. When a driver turned into a corner with some commitment, the Vigor responded with a confidence that its drivetrain layout had no business delivering. The nose went where it was pointed. The rear stayed composed. The car didn't push wide the way a conventional front-wheel drive sedan would when asked the same question. That 60-40 weight distribution was doing exactly what Honda's engineers designed it to do. The steering feel reinforced the impression. Most front-wheel drive cars of that era delivered steering that was accurate but distant, a functional tool rather than a conversation. The Vigor's steering had more texture to it. Drivers could sense what the front tires were doing, could feel the grip loading up through a corner, could use that information the way you'd want to in a car positioned as a sports sedan. It wasn't telepathic. It wasn't a BMW 3 Series, but it was meaningfully better than the segment standard. The 5-cylinder engine added its own layer to the experience. At highway speeds, it settled into a smooth, slightly unusual idle that was quieter than most 4s and distinct from any 6. Push the throttle with intent, and the note changed, developing a slightly raw, layered quality that didn't fit neatly into any familiar category. Some drivers found it exotic. Others found it unfamiliar in a way that took getting used to. Nobody found it boring. Power delivery was linear and predictable. 176 horsepower wasn't a dramatic number, even in 1992, but the engine didn't feel strained at its limits the way an undersized 4 might. It pulled cleanly through the rev range without the plateau that sometimes makes smaller engines feel like they're running out of ideas. The suspension tuning was firm. Honda calibrated it for composure rather than comfort, which was a deliberate philosophical choice and also a risk. Buyers in this price range had options, and some of those options were considerably softer over broken pavement. The Vigor prioritized body control over cushioning, European reference over American expectation. But the compromises were there. Torque steer under hard acceleration was present and noticeable. When the driver pushed hard off a corner or accelerated aggressively from a stop, the steering pulled, a reminder that all that engineering intelligence hadn't changed the fundamental fact that the front wheels were still doing both jobs. The weight distribution helped, the geometry helped. But 176 horsepower through a front axle still behaved like 176 horsepower through a front axle. The interior was well appointed without being opulent. Wood trim, leather seating, a clean and legible instrument cluster. Quality materials handled with restraint. Compared to the German cars it was chasing, the cabin felt honest but conservative. Functional rather than atmospheric. On the road, the Vigor delivered most of what Honda had promised. The engineering worked. The problem was never the car itself. The Vigor launched in 1992 into a market that had already made up its mind about most things. American luxury sedan buyers in the early 90s operated on a clear and largely unspoken hierarchy. German cars sat at the top, not because every buyer had driven one back-to-back against the competition, but because the story was settled. BMW meant driving, Mercedes meant permanence, Audi meant engineering with a certain European severity. These weren't just cars, they were positions. And positions in a status market are surprisingly hard to argue with, no matter how good your counter-argument is. Below the Germans, the Japanese brands had carved out real ground. Lexus had launched in 1989 and immediately reframed what Japanese luxury could mean. The LS400 was quieter than a Rolls-Royce at highway speed, built to tolerances that embarrassed much of the European competition, and priced in a way that made the value case almost impossible to ignore. Lexus wasn't trying to beat BMW on driving feel. It was offering something different: silence, smoothness, reliability wrapped in genuine comfort. Buyers understood that immediately. Acura's own Legend sat above the Vigor in the lineup and offered a smoother, more traditionally luxurious experience with a V6. It wasn't as driver-focused as the Vigor, but it was easier to understand. The Legend made sense as a proposition. You paid more, you got more. The car felt like it justified its price on first contact. The Vigor slotted into the space between, above the Integra, below the Legend. Priced around $26,000 at launch, which put it directly against the entry-level BMW 3 Series and the Lexus ES 300. That positioning was the problem, not because $26,000 was unreasonable for what the car delivered, but because both of its direct competitors had cleaner stories to tell. The BMW 3 Series buyer wasn't shopping on value. They were buying a specific feeling, a specific image, and a specific promise that had been built over decades. Entry-level BMW ownership meant something in 1992, in a way that was cultural as much as mechanical. The badge carried weight that Honda hadn't had enough time to accumulate. The Vigor could match the 3 Series in several dynamic categories. It couldn't match what the 3 Series meant to the person writing the check. The Lexus ES300 came at the problem from the opposite direction. It was softer than the Vigor, quieter, less demanding, and built around a value proposition that required almost no explanation. More car, less money, nothing to worry about. The ES300 didn't ask its buyer to think about weight distribution. It didn't need them to appreciate the significance of a longitudinal engine mount in a front-wheel drive chassis. It simply delivered comfort and reliability in a package that felt immediately rewarding. The Vigor asked something of its buyer. It asked them to understand why it was interesting, to value what it had achieved mechanically, to care about the gap between 63% front weight bias and 60%. Most luxury buyers in 1992 weren't equipped to care about that, and the ones who were had already decided they wanted a BMW. Acura's marketing team understood the engineering story well enough to repeat it. What they couldn't do was make mainstream luxury buyers feel anything about it. Technical achievement needs a human translation to move people, and the Vigor's translation never landed with the audience that mattered commercially. The car had earned its place on merit. The market wasn't interested in merit that came without a familiar name attached to it. The sales numbers were about to make that unmistakably clear. The first year was quiet, but not alarming. In 1992, Acura moved roughly 14,000 Vigors in the American market. For a new model in a competitive segment, that number wasn't a catastrophe, but it wasn't momentum either. It was the kind of quiet start that needed to build, needed word to spread, needed buyers who had driven one to tell the buyers who hadn't. That momentum never came. 1993 sales declined. 1994 declined further. The Vigor wasn't collapsing, but it was drifting, losing ground quietly in a segment where visibility and buzz were the difference between a model that survived and one that didn't. And through all of it, Acura did something that still puzzles the people who followed the car closely. They did almost nothing. No mid-cycle refresh. No performance variant to generate press attention. No special edition to remind buyers that the car existed and had something worth talking about. The Vigor arrived in 1992 looking a certain way, performing a certain way, priced a certain way, and it left in 1994 looking essentially identical. 3 model years, and the changes between them were cosmetic details that most buyers wouldn't have noticed standing in a showroom. This wasn't neglect exactly, it was a signal. Internally, Honda had already begun the conversation about what came next, and the Vigors wasn't part of that future. Dealers reported something consistent during those 3 years. Customers weren't hostile to the Vigor, they just weren't sure what to do with it. It sat above the Integra in price and below the Legend in status, and neither of those reference points made it easy to close a sale. A buyer who walked in wanting something sporty usually left with an Integra. A buyer who wanted something prestigious usually left with a Legend, or walked across town to a BMW or Lexus showroom. The Vigor kept getting passed over, not because it was bad, but because it was hard to explain quickly, and sales floors don't reward complexity. The broader economic context didn't help. The early 1990s recession had softened discretionary spending across the luxury segment. Buyers who were still purchasing in this price range were gravitating toward established names, toward the cars they already understood and trusted. A 3-year-old brand extension with an unusual engine configuration wasn't the safe choice, and in a recession, safe choices win. By 1994, the decision had been made. The Vigor would be discontinued. Its replacement was already being developed, and it was going to be a different kind of car in almost every meaningful way. The 1995 Acura TL kept the longitudinal layout. The inline-five was still there, and a 3.2-liter V6 joined it, but everything around the engineering had softened. The suspension tuning was more compliant. The styling was more conservative. The European reference points the Vigor had chased were quietly set aside. The mechanical DNA was still present, but the philosophy behind it was already fading. The full reversal came in 1999. The second-generation TL arrived with a transversely mounted V6 and a conventional front-wheel drive layout. The longitudinal experiment was over. That car sold steadily and without complication, in the way that sensible cars with clear value propositions tend to sell. Buyers understood it. Dealers could explain it in 30 seconds. It didn't ask anyone to appreciate the significance of a 60-40 weight split. The first-gen TL was the transition. The second-gen TL was the answer. And the answer was, stop asking buyers to care about the engineering. The market had spoken in the clearest possible language. It wanted comfort and clarity. The Vigor had offered something harder to name and something harder to sell. Time has been kind to the Vigor in a way the market never was. The engineering logic holds up. The 60-40 weight distribution wasn't a marketing claim or a press release number. It was a measurable, documented result of a specific mechanical decision. And the road tests from 1992 confirmed that it worked exactly as intended. The handling was genuinely better than a conventionally engineered front-wheel drive sedan of that era. The steering was genuinely more communicative. The chassis was genuinely more neutral. Honda's engineers set out to close the gap between front-wheel drive and the European sports sedan benchmark, and they closed a meaningful portion of it. The longitudinal inline-five is a legitimate mechanical achievement. It's easy to look back now and call it an overcomplicated solution to a problem buyers didn't care about. But that framing misses what it actually represented. Honda designed a purpose-built front end, a unique subframe, and a suspension geometry from scratch, specifically to make a front-wheel drive car behave in a way that contradicted everything the segment had accepted as normal. That's not over-engineering for its own sake. That's a genuine attempt to solve a real dynamic problem, executed with rigor and without compromise. Honda never built another front-wheel drive car with this layout. The cost was too high, and the commercial result had made the calculation clear. The Vigor remained a single application of an idea that worked technically and failed commercially, and that combination is rare enough to be worth remembering. What's happened since the mid-2000s is interesting. Enthusiast communities built around Honda and Acura history have gradually recognized the Vigor for what it was. The forums and collector groups that emerged as the car age past novelty and into genuine rarity have developed a specific appreciation for its mechanical story. People who seek these cars out now aren't buying them, despite the longitudinal inline-five. They're buying them because of it. The thing that confused showroom buyers in 1992 became the point of the car 30 years later. Well-preserved examples are genuinely hard to find. Low production numbers combined with minimal mainstream attention meant fewer of them survived the normal attrition of daily use, deferred maintenance, and time. The car that sat on dealer lots moving slowly is now the car that serious collectors search for patiently. That particular reversal happens occasionally in automotive history, and it always says something about the gap between what the market rewards immediately and what turns out to have been worth building. The broader lesson the Vigor carries is one that surfaces repeatedly in automotive history. Engineers solve problems, markets respond to stories. When those two things align, a car becomes successful. When they don't, the engineering record and the sales record diverge completely. And you end up with a situation where the most technically interesting car in a segment is also the one that moved the fewest units. Honda solved a problem in the Vigor that most buyers didn't know they had. The weight distribution, the unique engine orientation, the handling balance, these things required a specific kind of attention to appreciate. They weren't visible at a glance. They didn't translate into a simpler, warmer story about comfort or reliability or status. They lived in the details, and the details required explanation. And explanation is where sales go quiet. The Vigor also marks something specific in Acura's history. It was the last time the brand took a genuine engineering risk in the mid-size segment. The TL that replaced it was a better commercial product and a less interesting mechanical object. Everything that followed in that segment continued in the same direction. Softer, quieter, more accessible, more competitive on conventional terms. The path the TL opened was the right path for the business, but the Vigor represents the road not taken. The moment when Acura's engineers had enough authority and enough budget to build the car they believed in, without the accountants reshaping it into something easier to sell. That doesn't happen often. When it does, the result tends to be exactly what the Vigor was. A car that gets everything mechanically right and arrives at precisely the wrong moment in market history to be rewarded for it. The engineers won the internal argument. The market decided it didn't matter. Remember that engine facing the wrong direction. That wasn't a mistake. That was a room full of engineers who hadn't been told no, yet. Who mounted an inline-five longitudinally in a front-wheel drive chassis, not because it was cheaper or simpler or easier to explain in a showroom, but because it was right, because the physics demanded it and nobody stopped them. 3 years later, the accountants had their answer. The TL arrived with a transverse V6, a conventional layout, and a value story that practically sold itself. It was the corrected version, the sensible version, and it worked exactly as intended. But here's the question worth sitting with. When every edge gets smoothed, every risk gets priced out, and every engine gets pointed in the direction that's easiest to explain, are we building better cars or just safer ones? The Vigor pointed the wrong way, and it drove better for it. If that question stays with you, the next video is worth your time. A Lexus sedan that at 70 miles per hour produced almost no sound at all, while its German rivals were quietly falling apart. Subscribe and find out why it survived when everything else didn't.